Williams, and I'm giving a lecture format of my essay. It's called Radical Islam versus Islamic Radicals, a discussion, and it's based off of my essay, Salafism, Wahhabism, and the Definition of Sunni Islam, which I wrote for my honors capstone last year. So I'm going to start out by talking about different branches of Sunni Islam, and it's sort of divided into two different groups. There are traditional Sunni Muslims who follow one of the four madhabs, or schools of law, which I'll get into shortly, and then the others are reformist Sunni Muslims who follow some other type of authority outside of the madhabs. And these reformist Sunnis can be divided into maybe three different groups: the modernist Salafis, the traditionalist Salafis, and the Salafi Jihadis. And all of these reformist Sunni groups took care of favorable historical circumstances and their rights to prominence, and they also took, and like divisions that we see within like the Middle East and the Muslim world today can be traced back to these groups' differing reactions to modernity, which is I define as just like Western like ideas, inventions, things of that nature being brought into the Muslim world around 1800 of the Common Era, give or take a couple of decades. But first we need to talk about why does any of this matter. So I'd like to show you a short clip from a speech that happened not too long ago.
Islam is a political ideology. It is a political ideology. It definitely hides behind this notion of it being a religion. And I have a very, very tough time because I don't see a lot of people screaming Jesus Christ with hatchets or machetes or rifles shooting up clubs or hatcheting, literally axing families on a train. Or like they just killed a couple of police officers with a machete. I mean, it's unbelievable. So,
all right, that's enough of him. So that was Michael Flynn. As the slide mentions, you can. He was a former brigadier general who was actually for Trump's cabinet, and he was also the national security advisor. So the fact that he had to deal with sorry, I just realized you guys can't see the screen. I'll move over here if that's all right. Sorry. But yeah, so he gave that speech at a conference that was put on by a group called Act for America, which the Southern Poverty Law Center, like an anti-hate group and legal center in the United States, defines as the largest grassroots anti-Muslim hate group in America. And that was founded by a woman named Bridget Gabriel, who also claims to have the Muslim Brotherhood's secret plan to take over America. I'll talk a little bit more about the Muslim Brotherhood later. So first I'm going to talk about traditional Sunni Islam. According to a Pew poll, 85% of all Muslims are considered Sunni. So my essay applies only to those 85 to 90% approximately of Sunni Muslims. Because Shia Islam is just a very different religion than Sunni Islam. They're both part of Islam, but they have important differences, and so my essay applies only to Sunnis. And then I also would like to note that the four madhabs that I use are the Sunni madhabs. There are more madhabs in existence outside of the four Sunni ones, but because I'm focusing on Sunni Islam, I'm going to be focusing on the four madhabs that are applicable there. So, speaking of the madhabs, Jonathan Brown uses the four madhabs to denote the definition of Sunni Islam, so I'm sticking with that here. And each one of them has centuries, if not a millennium, of legal scholarship that goes behind each one. So they've been studying law for hundreds of years, and they each have their own sort of unique specialties. The Hanafi school focuses mostly on reasoning to sort of determine what the best course of action would be with regards to religious matters, and it was used primarily anywhere where the Ottoman Empire ruled, which is over much of the modern Middle East, because the Ottomans adopted the Hanafi school. The Maliki school is practiced primarily in North Africa, and it's named after its founder, Malik ibn Anas, and they primarily focus on the practices of the people of Medina, because that was the first city and the first community of Muslims. So that's their source for Islamic law. Next is the Shafi'i school, which is named for its founder, al-Shafi'i, and they use something called usul al-fiqh, which is the focus on the sources of the law itself. So not necessarily any one particular area, but just what is the root source of what they happen to be looking at. That's very prominent in Egypt, Lebanon, Palestine, and Yemen. And then the Hanbali school is named for its founder Ibn Hanbal, and they focus on the hadith, which is the word or recorded sayings of prophets of Muhammad, whether it's from his family, his friends, or just various different scholars, any purported saying of the Prophet Muhammad is considered a hadith. And these are primarily popular in Arabia and the Persian Gulf area. And this is very important because the Hanbali school sort of serves as like the jumping off point for these reformist Sunni groups. So first I'm going to start by talking about modernity and crisis. So the roots of this sort of like crisis of modernity comes in Islamic interactions with the West, which was definitely like a seismic shift in sort of like the way like the Muslim world viewed itself and interacted with other people. When Europeans, they had just come out of the Industrial Revolution, so they're looking for new markets and new resources that they would take either by peace or by force, more often than not by force. And so when faced with like European military and technological superiority, it's like this led to the massive defeat of like Muslim peoples all across the Middle East. And like large swaths of formerly Muslim land fell under the control of Europeans, as evidenced by the map on the slide. So like Muslims began to wonder, it's like if we're God's chosen people, how could this have happened to us? And so reformers looked for answers beyond the established authority, which is the madhabs, because in their minds, the established authority clearly had not gotten the job done in terms of protecting the Muslim world. So one of the examples of like this like just huge European technological superiority comes in the 1898 Battle of Omdurman. Omdurman is located in Sudan, and on the slide I have two different sort of like depictions of the battle. The first of which is like a late 19th century painting called Charging the 21st Lancers. It's sort of like typical Orientalist art in that it like portrays these heroic charging Europeans against these sort of like Muslim savages who are like squatting and like they look kind of scared down there. And then we also have a screen capture from a film about the Battle of Omdurman, which was filmed at the site in 1939. But what like neither of these like actually show you is that like the British had large numbers of machine guns present at the battle. And yeah, so like as you can see, like when you have these guys like lined up, like they're just sitting ducks for machine guns, and thousands upon thousands of Muslim people were slaughtered in this battle. And it's also historically significant because this was the first battle that Winston Churchill actually took part in. So like these sort of like interactions between like the West and Islam, like it goes both ways. It shapes Islam and it shapes Europe. So after Europeans had established control over Muslim areas, the general trend was that Islamic law was gradually replaced by European law. And it happened differently in a lot of different places, and for the purposes of my essay, I focused on colonial administration of law in British India, and then I also focused on the evolution of Ottoman law in the 1700s and the 1800s. But like always, the end result was that Islamic law was fundamentally altered, if not replaced outright. So in India, what they had was a three-tiered legal system. At the top of the legal system, you had British judges and law basically at the top of the hierarchy. And you had sort of like this mixed system where like Islamic judges and British judges would work together to like serve verdicts on cases in the middle. And then at the bottom tier was purely Islamic law. And so like this was set up in this manner because the British primarily viewed Islamic law as a massive individual opinions that like lacked any like universal guiding principle. So like they thought that like it had to be subsumed by the more civilized British law. And then Muslim judges, like after they were subordinated to this British system, they lost their individual initiative in cases. So like they were forced to stick with a very like strict like codified European sense of the law and didn't have much freedom to like look at cases on a like case by case basis. They had to adhere to more strict standards. And then in terms of Muslim people, this forces them to live by two legal codes. It's like, do you stick with the legal and moral code that you've been raised with and that you believed in, or do you stick with the one that's being enforced upon you by the pain of punishment? And then in the Ottoman Empire, I'm going to start by looking primarily at how the Ottoman Empire enforced penalties for stealing. So in the Quran, there's a rather, well, nowadays it's rather infamous verse from Surah 5, Ayat 38, that is like talks about how amputation is the punishment for stealing. However, like a third of all theft like punishments in the Ottoman Empire in the time period that I specified were like punished by like the thief was conscripted as an oarsman in the Navy. So like Ottoman ships at the time were powered by like oars, so like you just basically went onto a ship and you served in the Navy for a set period of time, and that was how they punished that crime. Corporal punishment and amputation was rare and always discretionary based on a case-by-case basis, because like the Quran isn't actually very clear on whether you must amputate the hand or not, and when you actually look at the verse, it's like rather vague at all, and like it doesn't really like require amputation in any sense. It's just more of a selective reading. And then banishment was also a very common punishment for stealing. You'd just be sent off to an island in the Mediterranean, and then you'd be left there. And there were a lot of people who managed to get off the island and go back, and if the authorities caught you, you just went back to the island. But then while you're comparing this to something similar in Europe, in England in the late 1700s, if you got caught stealing something from like an industrial factory, you were punished by death, like straight just death penalty, like if you were caught stealing anything. So like in many ways, it's like, supposedly like barbaric Islamic law is actually a lot more humane when compared to how Europeans worked at the time. And then also it's important to note the distinctions between positivist law, which is Western law, and then Islamic law. Positivist law, like the source of that law is an individual human entity. It's like a king, a magistrate, a council, something of that nature. And the nature of the punishment is always punitive, like it's designed to punish you for doing something bad. And this sort of takes like a Hobbesian view of human nature, views human nature as fundamentally bad, and the job of the law is to prevent chaos from breaking out because people are just fundamentally evil. And then positivist law, like in the West, is also codified and universalized, so that way, like it's applicable in just like all circumstances, and like there isn't really any room for like individual discretion. And then the law is followed because you fear the punishment that comes from not following the law. Meanwhile, Islamic law is completely different. The source of law is God for Muslims, and in the like sort of like the moral nature of this law means that like it's not really about like preventing order from being subsumed by chaos. It's designed to show people how to live morally good lives. So human nature isn't necessarily evil in the Muslim sense of the law, and it's not codified, and so that means that it's not universal for all Muslims. I just talked about the 4 different madhabs. So like each of those madhabs has a different way of enforcing the law, and within those madhabs, individual judges view different Quranic verses, different ways. Like it produces tremendous variance in how the law is enforced, and oftentimes it's not as strict. And the law is followed because it's the morally right thing to do, as opposed to being afraid of being punished. So, when Europeans phased out Islamic law, Muslims lost much more than legal code. They lost their moral code, their moral compass, and they had the very fabric of their universe torn or ripped apart. And so this forces a response of some kind. The Sunni traditionalists responded by putting themselves deeper into their madhabs, and the reformist Sunnis chose to abandon the madhabs. And they primarily chose to look at the actions of the Salaf, which are the first generations of Muslims, Prophet Muhammad's family, his companions, and just other people who he interacted with. And then the Salafi groups looked to them for that. And so this brings us to the modernist Salafism section. And so 2 of the foremost legal scholars in the modernist Salafi movement are Rashid Rida and Muhammad Abduh. And led by these scholars, modernist Salafis began to reconsider the law and especially the hadith, because they took the Hanbali view, and they began to discard sort of the unreliable hadith, which I'll get into now. So hadith, there are very multiple different categories for what can be the true word of the Prophet Muhammad. A mutawatir hadith is most definitely a confirmed true word of the Prophet Muhammad because it has multiple isnads, or a chain of transmission. So when you're looking at a hadith, before you even get to the actual saying, there's a list of every single scholar that has transmitted that hadith. So if you're looking at a mutawatir hadith, the isnad starts with the Prophet Muhammad, works its way down through his companions to the different founders of the various legal schools, and then if it's long enough, it goes all the way down to the present day. So if you end up transmitting a hadith, you are able to add your name onto that and thus become part of the tradition, which I think is very cool. And then you also have the Sahih, which is the highest level of confirmation for a hadith. And then on the flip side of that coin, you have the Ahad hadith, which are the unconfirmed word of the Prophet Muhammad. It might be legitimate, it might not. When I was taking Dr. Zargar's Islam class, he shared with us a hadith that said that the Prophet Muhammad commanded all Muslims to buy onions from this one specific vendor. And that's definitely not a confirmed hadith. That's someone who paid off a hadith scholar to write it for him. So that's a tremendous variance. You have the bona fide word of the Prophet Muhammad, and then you have just blatant fabrications like that. So you have to be able to distinguish between all of them. And another example is that one hadith claims the sun prostrates itself before God, and that's why we have nighttime. And this one's counter to science, so this sort of makes it an ahad hadith and not mutawatir. And so for Muhammad Abduh, you only want to look at the mutawatir hadith and the sahih hadith because they have that confirmation. and that allows you to sort of follow like European like modernist ideas, like believing that the sun like sets at night because of the Earth's rotation, while also staying true to the basic core tenets of your Islamic faith that you know to be true without a doubt. Next, we'll be moving to traditional Salafism, which is in contrast to modernist Salafis because they look only at the hadith for guidance. And like they only like discard a hadith if it's widely discredited by Islamic scholars. So like they will look at like ahad hadith potentially, because if it's not like agreed upon that the hadith is not accurate, then they'll still follow it. And then also for traditional Salafis, if you don't follow the hadith, you are not a true Muslim, which is like extremely different from the modernist Salafis. And so this leaves no room for like European ideas, or so they would claim. And one of the most notable figures in the traditional Salafist movement is Muhammad ibn Abd al-Wahhab, who I will refer from this point forward, since it's a very long name, as al-Wahhab. And then also like Muhammad Nasir al-Din al-Albani. So like Muhammad al-Wahhab started his own branch specifically of traditional Salafism called Wahhabism. And he's basically the father, so that's why I had his name bolded on the previous slide, and his ideas expressed as a doctrine are known as Wahhabism. So what are the characteristics of Wahhabism? You primarily look to the Salaf for guidance on how to be a Muslim, and you reject anything that's called bid'ah or innovation. Bid'ah for Wahhabis is classified as anything that comes after the Salaf, the first few generations of Muslims. And that's literally anything. So that includes Sufism, that counts European ideas, that includes the madhabs that the traditional Sunnis follow. Anything that's not Salaf is not truly Islam for the Wahhabis. And they prefer to call themselves al-Tawheed, or the assertors of divine unity. And Tawheed is basically like an Islamic concept of like monotheism. It's belief that like there is only one God. And so like thus any monotheistic faith has its own version of Tawheed. But Wahhabi Tawheed is different in that it specifically declares that God alone is Lord and that he must be worshipped exclusively. And that's a very important point, because a lot of times like Muslims, they like sort of had like different practices that emerged after the Salaf that the Wahhabis viewed as like not worshiping God exclusively. I also would like to note that Wahhabism is not the same as Salafism. A lot of times in the media you might see it used as interchangeable terms, but the crux of my argument is that they are not the same thing. There are extremely important differences. So one of the ways in which they differ is how Wahhabis and traditional Salafis treat other Muslims. Wahhabis primarily are very intolerant. They are not open to other ideas. And they are willing to condemn other people who do not follow them. This is very different from modernist Salafis. Modernist Salafis may not agree with your view, but they're willing to engage in debate, and they certainly will not condemn you for thinking differently than they do. Yes. And then this is problematic because Muhammad Abd al-Wahhab primarily said that the name and the life and the property of apostates, which is anyone who's not Wahhabi, is forfeit. So you can imagine how that would be problematic. And then more on apostasy. Any form of bid'ah or innovation is apostasy. So this would include the madhabs. So Wahhabis view modernist Salafis, traditional Salafis that aren't them, or traditional Sunni Muslims as apostates. And then Wahhabism is also sort of ethnocentric. The Salaf, the original Muslims, were all sort of Arab and part of the Bedouin ethnic group. And so when you're looking at customs that sort of come from Iran, Sufism, grave veneration came from Turkey, and then rationalism, Western thought was viewed as a Greek import. Because those people weren't sort of Bedouin, the ideas are immediately discarded by Wahhabis. And so if you aren't Muslim, you're either an infidel or an apostate. An apostate is basically a Muslim in the Wahhabi view who masquerades as a Muslim but who actually isn't. An infidel would be someone who's a Christian or just someone who isn't Muslim and admits to not being Muslim. So this is an example of the Ikhwan, which are sort of fanatical religious shock troops of the Saudi army in the 1800s. So when your faith tells you that the life and property of apostates and people who don't agree with you are forfeit, that sort of gives you a lot of the leeway to go out and conquer them and then treat them poorly when you do go through there. An example of this comes in the early 1800s with the city of Karbala in Iraq. This is a very important city for Shia Muslims. There are a lot of important graves, scholarly documents, a lot of things like that. It's a very important part of their faith. And it got sacked and razed completely to the ground by the Saudi Ikhwan during this time period. And there was also a genocidal cleansing of the inhabitants as well, because they were all viewed as apostates, and thus their lives were forfeited, and so they simply murdered them, which is very sad. And then when the Ikhwan sort of went into Mecca, they started taking down domes and mausoleums that the Salaf had built, because they viewed the building of those structures as bid'ah. So, if Wahhabism is intolerant and spread by fearsome armies in the past, why does it appeal to Muslims today? And the answer can be found in Saudi history. So, Wahhabism, it originates in the Najd region of Saudi Arabia, which is basically a backwater, in the words of David Commons, in all senses. Intellectually, it never produced any great scholars, because like Mecca was sort of like the heart of Islam and Islamic scholarship was like just down the coast. So like a lot of people from Najd would go to Mecca to study, become judges, and then go back. And so like you also had different leaders in Najd and in the Hijaz that like often weren't on very good terms. So like you only studied in Mecca and then you went back. And so Najd was also very like insular, and like there also aren't a lot of resources there. It's primarily desert. Like it's the middle of Saudi Arabia. So like, and this was before like oil had been cultivated. So basically what the residents did there was like they herded animals, or they were subsistence farmers around oases. So now we get a little bit into the life of al-Wahhab. So he studied briefly in Hijaz, like many people who wanted to become Islamic judges in Najd, but then he became disillusioned with the practices he saw there. He didn't see them as truly Islamic, and he went back to Najd as part of the ulama, or religious scholars there, and he sort of bounced around from town to town. And he was never really welcomed anywhere because of his extreme views, as I articulated in the Wahhabism slide. So like his own father actually banned him from their hometown of Huraymullah, and the first town that he was a judge at, called Al-Uyayna, also evicted him because he wasn't like welcome there, and like they didn't like his ideas. And so like, why, might you ask, was he banned from some of these places? He destroyed the tomb of Zayd ibn al-Khattab, who is a contemporary of the Prophet Muhammad, and like a lot of people like to go to his grave to worship. And he also stoned a woman to death for adultery, which at that time was not a welcome practice in Najd whatsoever. But then Wahhab eventually finds his redemption when he goes to the city of Al-Diriyah, where he meets a man named Muhammad ibn Saud, who is a Najdi noble who was looking to expand into the Najd region outside of his oasis town. And so Al-Wahhab sanctions Saud's expansion, like in Najd and then outside of it, in exchange for Saudi protection and their help in spreading his version of Islam, which is articulated as Wahhabism. And so Saudi secular control of different areas, as they expanded across what is now Saudi Arabia, went hand in hand with Wahhabi religious control. And this is important because this becomes more than just like some random noble expanding his turf in Saudi Arabia. It's like a holy war against more tolerant opponents. It's the Saudis and the Wahhabis versus everyone else. But initially they were unsuccessful. The Ottoman Empire is still very strong at this time, as well as the Egyptians, and they wanted to keep Bedouin and Saudi forces under control, and so they launched multiple expeditions that kept them contained to Saudi Arabia. And so Muhammad ibn Saud realizes that he needs a lot of like help to be able to like shake the Ottoman yoke. And so for that, he goes to the British. So the Saudi-British alliance started in 1865 as like a method of Great Britain to sort of undermine Ottoman influence in this area and sort of like pave the way for British control. And they did that primarily through sending money and weapons to Saud's forces. Sort of the culmination of this alliance comes during World War I in 1915, where one of Muhammad ibn Saud's sons was actually knighted by the British Empire. And this also, like with the money and the weapons, allows one of Saud's sons to revive the Ikhwan and sort of makes them into his army that helps him expand across Saudi Arabia. And now that he's got British help and the Ottomans are occupied fighting World War I, the Saudi campaigns to conquer Arabia are very successful. So the Ikhwan are used to basically wipe out Sharif Hussein of Mecca, who is Ibn Saud's main rival for control of the Arabian Peninsula, and they do everything that they can to make sure that Wahhabism is the only accepted norm. And that comes to the tune of 40,000 public executions and 350,000 amputations. But when Ibn Saud tries to expand into Iraq, the RAF mobilizes some of their air force that they had at the time, and they basically machine gunned his troops and said, "You will not move beyond Saudi Arabia." But at that point, he had already taken over the entire area, so that was Saudi control. So like until like around like the mid 20th century, Wahhabism was largely contained to Saudi Arabia, and all that changes when oil money comes into the area. It's the primary means of spreading influence, both in like the secular Saudi sense and in the Wahhabi religious sense, because schools, mosques, and such were built abroad by Saudi funded, like by the government or by Saudi government related entities like the Muslim World League or the Muslim Student Organization of America. And like they started like propagating Wahhabi teachings in these schools, in these community centers, and sort of helped it spread abroad. And so thus like Wahhabism kept its sort of intolerant character, but it lost the sort of like the association with the potentially genocidal Ikhwan. So out of these sort of different groups, we have our fourth reformist Sunni group, which is the Salafi Jihadis. And so while the Saudis are patronizing different traditional Salafi groups, one of them is the Muslim Brotherhood, which is founded in Egypt in 1928. They shared Wahhabi anti-Western sort of ideas and the idea that Islam is the only true faith. They were also opposed to the British regime that was controlling Egypt, as well as the subsequent Nasser government. Gamal Nasser took over Egypt in the 1950s, and he sort of brought its like a nationalist like Arab government to Egypt after it had been previously ruled by the British. And sort of the father of this Muslim Brotherhood was a man named Sayyid Qutb, and he also sort of like believed that Islamic society at this time was living in a state of what's called Jahiliyyah, which is basically sort of like pre-Islamic like barbarism present in the Arabian Peninsula prior to the introduction of Islam. So that's sort of like the mid-20th century, and then like as like Wahhabi groups are spreading, 1980s Afghanistan. So as you may or may not be aware, the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan in 1980. And when that happened, Muslim people, especially Wahhabis, saw it as like another Western attempt to make inroads into the Muslim world. And so like people like Wahhabis, like a lot of like various disparate Wahhabi groups said it's the duty of Muslims to go and fight against the Soviets in Iraq. And so like various jihadi groups answer that call, and they go to Afghanistan, and they all sort of follow Wahhabi doctrine to an extent, but there is no like core idea of it yet. And one of the most important groups is called Maktab al-Khidmat, or MAK. It was founded by a man named Abdul Azam, and he was sort of like a well-respected scholar. He studied at Al-Azhar in Cairo, which is like an extremely prestigious university, and so he had the religious bona fides to start up this movement. But the guy who funded it was a name that you would definitely be familiar with, which is Osama bin Laden. So eventually, bin Laden, since he himself is a Saudi, he gets the blessing of the Saudi Grand Mufti, which is basically the lead judge in Saudi Arabia, to come and sort of like propagate Wahhabi doctrine, as well as build training camps for these jihadis who are fighting in Afghanistan at the time. And then like eventually, after the course of an 8-year war, the Soviets withdraw, and then you have all these guys who have received weapons training and like sort of like schooling in Wahhabi doctrine from Osama bin Laden, but they don't have anywhere to go. So Osama bin Laden sort of takes this like idea, he wants to keep all these guys in contact. So he uses his money to like get the means to keep them all in contact, and this forms the basis in the early 1990s of the group that we know today as Al-Qaeda. And so like in the early 1990s, sort of like Salafi jihadism can be looked in sort of like in Jordan between two very important figures. This is based off of Eli Alshek's analysis of Jordanian Salafi jihadis in the early 1990s, all the way up until the present. So primarily there were two important figures. The first was Abu Muhammad al-Maqdisi, and the second is Abu Musa'ad al-Zarqawi. Al-Maqdisi was the original leader of the Salafi jihadi movement in Jordan, and he studied Islamic law and the Quran at various universities, so he's an extremely well-educated man. And he was not in favor of takfir, which is the concept of naming other people infidels, which I will address shortly. But Abu Musa'ad al-Zarqawi, on the other hand, although he was originally subordinate to al-Maqdisi in the movement, he studied the Quran in Afghanistan in the early 90s with like MAK and Al-Qaeda affiliated groups, and he takes a very puritanical Wahhabi view of like how Islam should be interpreted. And so like Salafi jihadism thus becomes characterized by its rejection of traditional Salafism, and that violence is both inevitable and acceptable as means of protecting Islam. And then like anyone from the West and apostate Muslims are people who need to be opposed at all costs. So like it's similar to Wahhabis in that they both have a desire to purge Islam of un-Islamic practices, but it's different because they are openly hostile toward any ruling elite in a Muslim country. And so this is different because like Wahhabis, like they basically got into bed with the Saudi leaders. So like they had no problems with teaming up with the secular government in order to protect themselves. Salafi jihadis are completely outside of that governmental structure. Takfir is basically, as I mentioned, the process of declaring other Muslims to be apostates. And these are primarily influenced by the ideas of Sayyid Qutb from the Muslim Brotherhood. And so any Muslim living under the governance of an Islamic country or in the West is an apostate simply by virtue of them living in that government. So, and that government can be anything. It can be democratic, it can be communist, it can be Ba'athist, which is basically Arab nationalism, sort of along the lines of Saddam Hussein. Well, he was just one example. Like Baathism is more expansive than that, but he's just a notable example. And so, like as I mentioned with the Wahhabis, their lives and property are forfeit, and they must be opposed at all costs. And this is all Muslim people. The government, everyday civilians are not to be interacted with, and they must be violently opposed. And so, like another key part of sort of this like Salafi jihadi takfir, especially under al-Zarqawi, is that you need to fight apostates at home before you go to fight abroad. And this matters a lot because al-Maqdisi sort of was steering guys towards, hey, let's go fight against the West, like let's fight against these infidels. But al-Zarqawi was saying, no, the more important fight is apostates at home. So thus, when you're looking at like Jordanian Salafi jihadis under al-Zarqawi, they started focusing their efforts on sort of toppling the Jordanian government instead of trying to go after governments in the West. And that's what I mentioned with the Salafi jihadi rift. Sort of like al-Maqdisi sort of is still the head of the Salafi jihadi movement, but his influence has waned greatly. And then al-Zarqawi sort of becomes the head of this group that's called like the Neo-Takfiris. And what's also very important about al-Zarqawi as a figure is because he was named Al-Qaeda's emir in Iraq, which is basically their term for a commander from 2003 until his death in 2006. And like after he died in 2006, the U.S. Army sort of thought, oh yeah, we've eliminated Al-Qaeda as a threat in Iraq, but in reality, the group basically went underground, and then in 2011 and 2014, Al-Qaeda in Iraq resurfaced under a new name, which we all know now as ISIS. So the takeaway sort of in this conclusion is that like Islam, when it comes to like Sunni groups, there's a whole gauntlet of like tolerant, peaceful like Muslims over here and the sort of like traditional Sunnis, all the way to intentionally intolerant and violent neo-takfiris. And there are many stops in between. So these are by far like not like Muslims is by far like not like a homogenous group. They're not a monolith. They're extremely different. But the issue is that there's no set definition of what it means to be Sunni anymore. Sunnis are still trying to figure that out. And so the West sees that, and they basically, instead of like appreciating the complexity of like Sunni Islam in its contemporary state, they just treat Islam as a monolith, and like it's usually in like a negative way. But the worst part about this is that the West is primarily responsible for this identity crisis because they introduced like modernity into the world at the hands, like at gunpoint pretty much, and forced Muslims to reply. And so Muslims sort of feel compelled to reform because of those interactions with the West. And so like it's sort of like a case of Muslims feeling compelled to fix something that wasn't broken. And the West like reverts to stereotypes of Muslims in an attempt to sort of like compensate for this lack of a clear set definition. I'd also like to say a few words about the Islamic State. When you look at like ISIS, they claim to have a caliphate, they claim to have an Islamic government, but when you actually look at it, ISIS isn't really an Islamic state. Even though they say that it is, it's faux Islamic because they've embraced Western practices like to modernize, and like it's not like truly Islamic because they don't focus on the moral issues. The caliphate in ISIS-controlled territory isn't focused on making its people better people. Like when you steal in an ISIS-controlled territory, you get your hand lopped off. But that's, like as I mentioned, that's not how Islamic law works. Like that would be a very like Western way of applying that like punishment. So the only way in which is Islamic is that they claim to base their punishment for stealing off of a Quranic verse, but in reality, it's not Quranic whatsoever. And it's sort of like a similar case with Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia, by getting into bed with the secular government and sort of embracing bid'ah, which includes things like cars, like there were no cars in the Quran. So originally, this Wahhabi ulama didn't want any cars in Saudi Arabia. They already sort of became a Western-style state, like as they allowed like the Saudi secular control to modernize. And so like madhabs are like a great way for Muslims to sort of provide like continuity in the face of these Western ideas without resorting to violence. But when the madhabs get rejected and you don't want to go that route, a void gets filled, and so and oftentimes it ends up being filled with this like weird mix of like Western and Islamic ideas that ultimately aren't true to either one of them. And so in conclusion, a Sunni is basically someone who respects all Islamic traditions now. Like regardless of whether it's their own, they do not condemn others, it's simply a measure of tolerance. Thank you. So I allotted the rest of the time for like questions that people might have. It can be about the presentation, it can be about anything like Islam related. Like I'm just here to answer any concerns that you guys might have or like questions, because like I want this to be like a learning experience for like everybody. So like I will do my best to answer all of your questions.
I have a question.
Yeah.
So I was wondering, I feel like I was kind of tracking this in your presentation, but I might be incorrect. Does it seem like many of the more intolerant and violent sects are often the most economically marginalized and disadvantaged? Would that be accurate to say?
Yeah, I think that's definitely I think that would be fair to say, because like a lot of times you look at Najd like as a region was very like marginalized economically, and so like that's sort of like a circumstance that definitely contributes to that. And I think that a lot of people today, just based off of, like my research, when they turn to sort of these like violent like jihadi like ideas, like they're doing so because they don't really have any other alternative. Like a lot of times when you look at like Sunni Muslims who are like fighting for ISIS, it's really, a lot of times it's not a matter of, oh yes, like I am completely on board with their ideas. Because like in that like part of Iraq, there isn't really a lot of employment. They're doing similar things to what was going on in Najd. They're subsistence farmers or they're herders, and that doesn't really pay the bills. But when an ISIS guy comes knocking on your door with a paycheck and a rifle, you take the rifle, you take the paycheck, and it's like they're fighting to basically like feed themselves and their family. So like one of the ways that I read about like potentially defeating ISIS in an article by Mark Juergensmeyer is that you sort of like empower like Sunni Muslims. You give them more voice in the Iraqi government. You give them sort of like an economic like improvement like plan of some kind, so they don't end up turning to like jihadism to pay the bills.
Then as a follow-up question, I don't know if you know sort of what's been going on in the Iraqi government over the past couple of years. Do you get the sense that there is a push to give the Sunnis more representation there?
No.
Oh.
No, because Iraq's population is majority Shia, but there's also a significant portion of Sunni Muslims. And one of those areas, like it's like northern Iraq, sort of near Mosul and Tikrit. I don't know, like maybe you guys have heard those names in the news. Maybe you haven't. I think I'm a lot more into those issues than a lot of other people are. But those are two like very like Mosul is actually the second largest city in Iraq, and it's mostly Sunni people. So, but the government is primarily run out of Baghdad, which is Shia majority, and like Basra in the south, which is where all the oil money is as well. So like the Shia Muslims in Iraq have most of the wealth. They have, for a while they had a monopoly on power in Iraq, like after Saddam Hussein. Mm-hmm. And so like they've sort of like, and Saddam Hussein was a Sunni Muslim actually, he was from Mosul. So like when he was in control, he like came down hard on Shia Muslims. So when Shia Muslims took back control, they sort of put that back onto the Sunnis, which isn't fair at all, because it was just Saddam. It was just one bad guy. It's not all Sunni people in general. So like there definitely is not a push for that. And like, I don't know if you've seen stuff lately, but the Kurds in northern Iraq actually voted for independence in a referendum, and the Iraqi government is saying that they're going to try to force them to stay, but the Kurds have their own army that's been bearing the brunt of the fight against ISIS, and they're sort of like, no, you won't. And so like that's sort of like another issue. The Shia Muslim-led government out of Baghdad is now coming into conflict with not only ISIS but also the like Sunni Muslim Kurds. Except the issue with like the Kurds is more of an ethnic one. Like they were supposed to have a country, but they didn't end up getting one. Sort of like in World War I with Sykes-Picot on one of the slides that I had. They didn't get their own home country. and now they've always wanted one, and now they sort of see with like the breakup of Iraq and Syria as a chance to get that. Yeah, any?
What made you interested in wanting to do your honors capstone in this?
Well, I can thank Dr. Zargar for that. I took his, what's the subject code now?
It's 263 now. It's the same title.
Yeah,
Islam.
it's just called Islam. When I took it was 300. Now it's 263. Sort of like not so shameless plug for his class, but like I took it because I wanted to learn about Islam because I'd seen so much of it on like the campaign trail, and like I didn't really understand Islam because like I come from like a lily white Chicago suburb north of the city. Like I've always been around Christian people. I didn't know any Muslims growing up, and so it's like I want to really learn about Islam because I also like one of the basic things I learned in this class is that Islam is like an Abrahamic religion. So like Christianity, Judaism, and Islam all trace like their backgrounds back to Abraham. So like Abraham is actually one of the 5 most important Islamic prophets, along with like guys like Noah and like even Jesus is like an important like prophet, because sort of like the way the prophets worked with Islam is that like each prophet brought like a different portion of God's message, and each like time a prophet popped up, the message got like closer and closer to what God wanted. And Muhammad is sort of like the last prophet, and he had like God's message as it was intended, contained in the Quran. So like I just thought stuff like that was just amazingly interesting, and I thought it's like, it's like Donald Trump is getting like, he's marginalizing these people, and like I want to really learn about it. Like what does it mean? What does radical Islam actually mean? Because like people toss that everywhere. It's like, oh yeah, Hillary and Obama are soft on radical Islam. Trump's taking a hard line. Like what actually is that? And so like, that was the crux of my essay. Yeah. Any other questions? You guys are writing stuff down. Is there anything for like? Is that like for a class or anything? Like, can I help you in that way?
It's mostly like we're looking at like Western interpretations of it.
Okay.
So this is interesting because it kind of goes along with like how few people spin this out of control, and then the Western media just takes and runs with it.
Yeah, that's one of the biggest problems. Like if you're looking for a way to sort of like reduce the like sort of like even like the appeal of jihadis, because like one of the other ways like ISIS recruits, like in the home countries they're offering people paychecks, but then once you get to like Western countries, like you see like there's like a handful of people from like Westernized countries that like go join ISIS. They go to Syria and Iraq, and then they come back, and people like, why do you feel like that way? It's because like people like in the media and people like Donald Trump, it creates this environment where a lot of people like, and they might be immigrants, so they might already feel like kind of uncomfortable in a Western country, and then people like Donald Trump certainly don't help to fix that comfort, and so they sort of like flee to these like online chat rooms as like solace to sort of find a place of acceptance, and that place of acceptance is an ISIS like message board that like promotes like jihad against non-Muslims or non-Wahhabis, and so like that's how people from the West end up getting like sucked into that vortex. Well, if you guys don't have any other questions, you can feel free to leave if you'd like. But I'm definitely, if you have like anything at all, just feel free to throw it out there. Like there are no bad questions. Thank you all for coming. I appreciate having a crowd.